On today's episode of Living with Money, I talk with Stephanie Bousley. Stephanie is the author of the upcoming book, Buy the Avocado Toast, a guide to crushing student debt, making more money, and living your best life, due out March 31st of this year. We talk about Stephanie's personal journey with student debt, the unconventional methods she used to pay down her debt, and how the book can help readers do the same. We also talk about the intertwined nature of someone's net worth and self-worth, and how we can work on improving both of those at the same time. So be sure to pick up a copy of the book in a few weeks, but first enjoy episode 112 of Living with Money, my conversation with Stephanie Bousley.
Welcome to Living with Money, a podcast aimed to make you feel comfortable with your financial life through conversations with authors, industry experts, business owners, and people just like you. Your host, Tim Mullooly, works for Mullooly Asset Management. All opinions expressed by Tim or any of his podcast guests are solely for their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Mullooly Asset Management. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. Clients of Mullooly Asset Management may maintain positions in securities discussed in this podcast. Here's your host, Tim Mullooly.
Welcome back to Living with Money. This is Tim Mullooly. On today's episode, I'm joined by Stephanie Bousley. Stephanie is the creator of the blog, You Are Not Your Debt, and she's also the author of the book, Buy the Avocado Toast, a guide to crushing student debt, making more money, and living your best life, which is due out in a couple weeks, March 31st of this year. So Stephanie, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Let's start with a brief background about you for the listeners. I know from reading your bio that you didn't study finance growing up, but if you can remember back, what was your first memory of money, and when did you know that, money was something important in life for people?
My very first memory of money is being about, 4 or 5 years old and being at the grocery store with my mom, seeing her write a check. And I asked her, why would people spend money when they could just write a check?
Right. Yeah.
So that was my basic child observation that prompted a conversation about, what checks were and all of that. What I really remember growing up is money had a very sort of emotional connotation to me and my family. We grew up very middle class, and I remember there were a lot of awkward moments when bills would come in the mail, or if we were out with relatives or another family, it was kind of a big to-do, like who would pay the bill at the end of the night. So that taught me that, money was more than just money, I guess. It was how people saw sometimes their own self-worth. That really took a turn when I, throughout my life, went from trying to marry my interests, which were finance and artistic, creative things. So I've worked at a hedge fund, and I've also gone to film school. And sometimes those worlds and the people living in those worlds feel like they're almost living in two different worlds.
Right.
So that was what prompted, I guess, me writing my book, was kind of me trying to make sense of all this.
That makes sense. And that's, important that you made that distinction between emotions and what money can do to that in people's relationships. Before you started your blog, You Are Not Your Debt, and before you wrote the book, Buy the Avocado Toast, can you kind of bring the listeners up to speed on your journey? I know you just mentioned, you went to film school and you work for a hedge fund. What was your life journey like, from high school to, getting a first job to where you are today?
When I was growing up in Minnesota, I remember thinking that other people who had money, or like rich people, just had a better life. And so when I was in undergrad, I started undergrad by wanting to study business, and I did major in international business. But about halfway through my undergrad, I kind of realized that I didn't really like being around finance people so much, and I really had more in common with creative types who were, reading and writing and watching movies. So I felt a little bit torn there, like I didn't really fit into either world. I went to college without my parents' support. I paid for everything myself, and I worked about 3 different jobs while I was in school, double majoring. I finished college with only about $15,000 of debt, which maybe sounds like a lot, but I didn't know how much more debt I'd be in later. So I
Right, right.
maybe it didn't seem that bad. And I had this belief that if I just worked really hard, watched my bank account and did as much as I could to earn money while I was getting my education, that I could finish and things wouldn't be that bad, and that was kind of the attitude I had when I then went into grad school at NYU to study film production. A couple of things happened with that. First of all, I didn't realize the program was extremely intense for the first 3 years. We didn't have time to have an after school job or a weekend job. We had to shoot our projects, in those times. And there was really just no free time of any kind to try to get a job other than teaching assistant, which I did. I graduated on a producing track, so I actually had to matriculate an additional 2 years after I finished full-time class to finish making my deliverables for my degree, which were 5 films, producing 5 films. So by the time you raise the money, go to the production, everything like that, it takes a while. So I had to pay matriculation fees those additional 2 years. So long story short, when I finished graduate school, I kind of didn't even want to look at my debt numbers. And I sort of made a point not to while I was finishing my degree, just because I didn't want to put myself into a panic. Over time, the rates grew, the debt compounded, and about maybe 5.5, 6 years after I started my first day of grad school, I was about $286,000 in student debt. That was sort of a shock to me because I was always like the responsible one. I was always the one getting straight A's. I had academic scholarship for undergrad and a small scholarship for grad as well. But I just couldn't believe how someone like me could be that much in debt. And I was kind of just paralyzed by it. So I went through a long period of feeling like a failure, probably drinking too much, picking up some unhealthy habits. I was desperately trying to intern and find a job that would allow me to live in a city like New York or Los Angeles, where the industry was, but also pay back these loans. I couldn't do that. And in 2011 or 12, I had an opportunity to be a nanny for an American family overseas who I had met at my time at NYU. And I ended up moving to Singapore, which is where my life took a very different turn from film.
Do you think that taking that move to Singapore was helped you out in the long run to kind of separate yourself from, what was going on, here in America, and your situation kind of just picking up and moving to a different situation gave you sort of a fresh start?
Yeah, I definitely felt like I could not make a nice life in either Los Angeles or New York at the time. It did seem like a good idea to just get away from it all. I had along the period I worked in Singapore, which was from about 2011 to the very end of 2016, I had times where I was happy with that decision and times where I thought I had ruined my life.
Right.
But one of the things that happened along the way was, well, 2 things actually. One was I just was around people with money. I got to observe the way that they thought about money, their own money, the money they were managing for other people, and just how they conducted themselves in the world. And the second thing was I learned about the foreign earned income tax exclusion, which meant that I didn't have to pay U.S. income tax on the first about $100,000 of my salary, which I wasn't even making $100,000 when I first moved per year. That meant I basically didn't have to pay income tax in the U.S. and only had to pay it in Singapore, which at that time it was between like 10 and 14%. So I had a lot of extra money to throw at the loans or invest/save. And I took full advantage of that, which put me in a better position when I moved back to the US. I had a lot less debt as well as some assets.
When you came back from Singapore. When and why did you start the blog and the website You Are Not Your Debt? And can you talk a little bit about that website and the blog and give listeners kind of an insight into what your main mission for that blog is?
It kind of first started with a frustration with other books that were out there, similar books, right? And people have started to talk about this a little bit in the press and stuff. But basically, every finance self-help book I read made me feel like I was irresponsible. I probably had a shopping problem. I probably spent my money on dumb things. If I just stopped going to Starbucks, life would be fine and I'd be out of debt. And for someone who's in maybe a couple $1,000s of credit card debt, that probably makes sense. But there was no one addressing what I felt was kind of my population, which was smart people that actually were responsible with money, except for they were in a lot of student debt. I just didn't feel like those books were for me or that they really understood my situation, which was if I don't go to Starbucks and that's my effort of paying a little more on my student debt, that means I can't go to Starbucks for like 20 years.
Right.
And which isn't realistic, and it's not really going to help me with my situation in any kind of big way. I felt that not a lot of people understood the situation I was in, but yet they must have that same or similar amount of debt because I went to school with other people. I know other people who also had similarly expensive grad programs that they attended. And yet no one was really talking about this. We talk about our projects or what we're working on, our writing, our internships, and everyone just kind of pretended they didn't have this financial death sentence like looming over their head. It was such a source of shame and pain for me. I never talked to anyone about my debt either. So I guess at one point I was working on, screenplays and I was writing stuff kind of just for fun. And I was like, well, what if I take the thing that's the most painful and shameful to me and I just open that up for everyone to see in the hopes of helping other people? That's when I decided to start kind of changing what I was writing and focusing on this topic. I decided I would just write like a proposal, like some overview first chapters, and I started sending those out to some publishing companies and some literary agents. I got some meetings off of that, and it took me multiple years to actually get my publishing deal, but it all came from a desire to help people and a desire to heal myself really by talking about my own struggles with feeling like a financial failure.
Did you find that writing your blogs and writing the book was therapeutic in a sense for you to kind of put pen to paper and kind of write down what you were going through and how it might help other people?
Yeah, and how a lot of people, when I would start talking to them, and I actually interviewed people for the book, they were totally unaware of some of the things that had helped me with my debt. Like most people do not have a sense of like how to work abroad or, how to lower their tax rate or how to increase their credit score and refinance. And these were just basic things that I kind of clunkily taught myself along the way. Yeah, and it just kind of grew from there. A frustration of how other sort of debt books were written, and then looking at the reality of people's stories, which were that, a lot of people felt that they would never be able to have a wedding or buy a house or do basic life things because whatever spare money they had went to their student debt.
Like I mentioned in the beginning, the book comes out March 31st, the end of this month, so a couple weeks away from this recording. If you're talking to a stranger about the book who doesn't know anything about it, what would you say to them in just like a few sentences could sum up the book? Or what's the one thing that you would like people to take away from reading your book?
I should have some kind of canned elevator pitch for this question, but
Right.
I really don't. The book it's about a holistic approach to really fixing your financial situation, not just in terms of money coming in, coming out, a holistic approach that talks about the psychological effects of debt and how to fix your finances and sort of your self-worth at the same time. So each chapter, I get into very out in the weeds topics such as, how to buy property or get a mortgage when you have 4 to 6 figure student debt, fixing your credit score in a matter of months instead of years, why you shouldn't always get a second job, evaluating whether your career is in line with your financial goals and what to do if it's not. I do go through how to find a job abroad and work abroad if that's something of interest and something people want to investigate further. And what I also really talk about is just how to stop financial self-sabotage, which I think is the thing that for me was missing from the other books, right? We often approach personal finance with the same kind of black and white simplicity that we use when we talk about losing weight, right? We're like, it's easy, just have less, more going out than coming in. That's if you're losing weight.
Right.
Opposite for finance. We're told it's easy, just tighten up your budget, eliminate joy from your life because anything that's not an absolute necessity is financially responsible. And if losing weight was that simple, no one would be overweight, right? Because we would just know, oh, eat less calories than I burn or whatever. But obviously, it's a more complex problem than that. And very smart people are overweight, even though we know it's just a simple caloric equation. In that vein, I feel there's a lot of reasons why people self-sabotage financially. And we really need to speak to those things and acknowledge them if we really want to help people and treat the problem, right? So we can tell someone, hey, don't buy that nice vacuum cleaner for your house, right? Just get a cheap one. And that may or may not be the best answer for that person because we don't know what feelings they have about personal cleanliness. Do they have a need to have a nice environment when they're working or at home? There's probably more to that person's spending choices than just, I want this expensive thing.
Another thing that I've seen you talk about is the importance of financial freedom. Based on your own experience and your own what happened with your debt and how you worked out of it, why do you think that being financially free is so important for people, and what does financial freedom mean to you?
I think financial freedom starts in the mind, actually, and it's kind of like wanting it bad enough. I want to get to a place where I'm not embarrassed of my finances. I'm not ashamed about the way I'm living my life. I can contribute to things I want to contribute to, saying, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get to that place. And then the second step is really looking honestly about the situation. So, for example, if you're $100,000 in student debt and you're working, a 30K job and living in New York City, obviously that's not going to compute at the end of the day. You can say that makes someone a victim. You can say maybe it was poor decision making when they were deciding to take out the debt, whatever. But for me, financial freedom just means being okay with your decisions, accepting whatever choices you made, and also having a commitment to building a different kind of future for yourself. And so being financially free doesn't necessarily, to me, mean debt free. It's like coming to a place of acceptance about what your life looks like and what you're really able to afford. And also figuring out how to have a little bit of extra money to do things that you just enjoy or that are enriching to your life.
Absolutely. I like that definition of financial freedom, just accepting the situation for what it is. You can't go back and change the past. So for whatever reason you've gotten to this point, you need to, accept that and then, not live in denial and think about, all right, how can I practically move forward and get better from here? Because I can't go back and change what happened in the past. Piggybacking off of that, once someone accepts, the situation that they're in, kind of like the example you laid out with someone living in New York City making 30K with 100K in debt, it doesn't really compute. How can changing someone's situation, like where they live or maybe who they associate with, or how they talk to themselves about money or about themselves, how can changing those things impact their finances?
Yeah, I think those things can really change everything about the way they think about their finances. For myself, my life has gone from being comfortable, being uncomfortable, having money, having nothing. So I feel like I kind of have hit the different points along the journey. Yeah, obviously there's people we associate with that bring us towards decisions we don't really like. For example, when I lived in Singapore, I had a friend who loved shopping. She always wanted to go to designer stores and look at the stuff with me. And that was really something I had to stop doing with her because it just made me feel bad. We were shopping, but I wasn't really shopping because I couldn't afford any of the stuff we were looking at in good conscience. Those are some of the more obvious choices. But I think sometimes it's about saying, yeah, I am in debt, but I'm also a person with hopes and dreams. And I am going to just decide to invest in myself, even when I could be paying off a little more debt. You know, a lot of people in my experience, big cities often appear to have more money than they actually have. And so it's important not to get caught up in that, right?
Right.
I knew a guy who was buying Rolex watches while he lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with 2 kids, and his kid like slept in his bedroom, right? Do you really need to spend 10 or 15K on a watch? Probably not. But again, that person has their reasons for doing that, right? Maybe they feel like it will benefit them in their career if they appear a certain way. So it's really not about telling them don't buy that thing or don't spend your money that way. It's about getting to the root of like, how does that watch make you feel on the inside? And how can you give yourself that feeling without sabotaging yourself financially?
We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. We'll be right back.
Investing for the future involves risk. Why trust your money with anyone but Maluli Asset Management? With 40 years experience, we're a family business ready to help with your investments. Tom and his 3 sons work to build financial plans and manage money on a fee-only approach. As a fiduciary, we're always committed to working in our clients' best interest while keeping your costs low. For a free report, go to www.maluli.net/money today.
So like finding ways to enjoy your life while also being financially responsible. I think you said it before, just stripping out all of everything that you spend money on. If you just strip out all of that, you might be financially better off, but you're probably going to be miserable because you're not doing anything you like to do.
Exactly. And most get out of debt books were sort of pitching that message of, you know, just eliminate any comfort from your life. And again, if you're only in a couple $1,000s of credit card debt, sure, I can live that way for a couple months. Right. But I don't want to live that way into my 40s and late 40s, you know?
Exactly.
So when I'm just punishing myself all the time and like going from a job I don't like to a second job that I don't like to like selling my belongings I don't need online, I mean, in general, all of that stuff is going to affect your self-esteem eventually. Maybe it's okay to live with roommates to save money, you know, in your 20s and 30s. But when you're older, you don't really want to live that way. And what it will do to your self-esteem may not be worth the money that you save. Because if all of your actions are telling yourself, I deserve the cheapest and the worst of everything, you know, you're probably not going to ask for that raise or go after the job you're a little unqualified for or ask out the person who's slightly out of your league. You know, right. It's kind of perpetuating a life of accepting the least and the worst, which is what I don't want readers to do.
Absolutely. That's no way to live your life. I definitely agree with that. I feel like conventional wisdom makes it seem like paying off large amounts of debts is simple when it really can be pretty difficult for people. How does the book and how did you kind of use more unconventional methods to pay off debt? And what are some examples of those unconventional methods that you used or that you outline in the book that people can use to pay off their debt?
The first thing that I did was I made fixing my credit score like the focus of my life, right? When I finished school, I was in these really predatory lending rate type of student loans. And I think I was paying 8.5%. And the loans, I think now they can't compound year on year, but they could back then. It got to a point where every month my student loans would earn or accumulate $1,600 in interest, right? So before I even paid anything, the loan had grown by $1,600 every month. And I was doing income-based repayment and all that. So I wasn't like defaulting or anything like that. But the reality was that the amount I had to pay, which was like $500 or $600, wasn't even covering the $1,600 of interest that the
Right.
loan got that
Yeah.
month. That pretty much was the first thing I had to stop, because emotionally, psychologically, that just felt like I was slowly committing suicide or something,
Right.
getting more and more into debt, even though I'm paying every month and so forth. Student loan refinancing was kind of a new thing back then. It's quite a bigger topic now, but a lot of people don't realize that you can refinance these things millions of times, right? So when I first graduated, I had bad credit. I wasn't making that much money. I had a ton of debt, and I would get rejections from these refinancing places all the time, right? No one wanted to loan me any money to help with my student loans. And every month I was just getting dinged this $1,600. I said, well, I have to put a stop to that. So I would continue to pay off my loans at the rate that I could. But every time I would get a raise, or, a chunk of time would pass, 6 months, where I maybe made 6 months worth of payments and maybe my situation was a little different, I would just reapply for refinancing again and again. And I did this for probably a year until someone finally took on the loan, and then my interest rate was like 6.8, right?
Right.
So over the years, whenever my credit would improve or my financial situation would improve, I would just refinance again to try to get a lower rate until it was down in the, 3% range, 2 to 3%, which is what it is now. So that, just being relentless about like, I will continue to apply until I get a lower interest rate, is kind of the first thing that stopped the hemorrhaging for me. And then, moving abroad was obviously pretty unconventional. I also tell people, like, don't get so caught up in these crappy second jobs, right? It's much more valuable for me to spend my time, writing a book that gives me a feeling of accomplishment and self-esteem than driving Uber, and maybe I earn a couple hundred extra bucks that month,
Right.
It's just not worth the toll to what it does to an already indebted, feeling bad person. So I always tell people, like, if your main career is not giving you what you need financially, like, how can we change that, And it's hard to get into specifics because people's situations are all very different. Just kind of like, let's attack those big things instead of making a big to-do about the smaller things.
Not like nitpicking all the tiny little everyday decisions that you make with your money, but more like you said, those bigger things, they're going to move the needle a little bit more when it comes to getting rid of debt and getting yourself on track financially. I definitely agree.
Yeah, and I will say one other thing. I did an interview with this guy, Travis Hornby, who runs studentloanplanner.com
Right.
recently. And they actually have an amazing approach for helping people who, like me, may have studied something that isn't a big paycheck. They work with a lot of like teachers and medical professions, artistic, creative professions. They encourage their clients to use the pay-as-you-earn model, where they pay the minimum, but at the same time, they're putting money into a savings account to pay for the tax that they'll owe when the debt is forgiven.
Right.
And depending on what your terms are and all that, that's also a good approach for people who think they're never going to make more than 100K a year or something like that, but they really don't want to make a career change. Taking advantage of some of the government programs while also taking into account the tax that you will owe might, for some people, mean paying a total less amount of money over time. So that's
Yeah.
I always try to push their philosophy because that's very true. And I wish I would have known that when I graduated, that there were other options out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually, we talked to Travis on this show too. He was on a previous episode, I think maybe 6 weeks ago or maybe 2 months ago. So for the listeners out there, I'll link in the show notes to the episode with Travis too. But yeah, everything that they're doing there is really great, and they have a lot of stuff there for people who have debt that not a lot of folks know about that they can utilize.
Yeah, and they'll come at it from a purely financial planner type of background. But again, I just think it's important for people to know that there's a million ways to approach this. It's just finding the one that's right for you, and the one that speaks to who you are and how you want to be spending your time in your career.
Absolutely. It's definitely a personal thing. We've kind of touched on the self-worth and net worth talk and how those things kind of play into each other. I wanted to ask, how intertwined do you think those two things are, someone's net worth and their self-worth?
Yeah, so I see this a lot, right? Because I worked as an executive assistant for a long time, and I would always see people taking on these types of jobs and then kind of this happens in all jobs, they become dissatisfied because their title doesn't look important enough on LinkedIn, or they feel like their job title doesn't really define them as a person. I think they're very intertwined, and I think it probably affects men even slightly more than women, because we tell men they have to be the providers in our society and all that. So I see this all the time, and I see it not just with people who are struggling financially, but I also see it with people who are millionaires and billionaires. I've had to be around a lot of those people in my career. Some of the easiest ways to kind of unravel this is to just try to look for ways in your life where you're kind of spending money to fill some kind of hole in yourself, not judging your insides by other people's outsides, right? Just because someone looks like they have money or they're spending and buying all this stuff, it really doesn't mean they actually have the money to be doing that.
Right. Yeah.
So just completely disassociating from whatever it looks like other people are doing. I've also, in my book, talk about simple things like unsubscribing to shopping websites and stuff like that, just to eliminate that chatter from your head of, buy this, buy that. Do you want this? Do you need some of this? How about this? Because that's everywhere online and in society. So almost like isolating yourself from some of the social media and the way other people are living their lives is a really big first step. And I think just being more direct with what we want from people is really helpful too, because sometimes making more money isn't going to fix the problem of I feel unappreciated. It might a little bit, but maybe the problem is actually that you need to be in an environment where there's more direct verbal feedback or something like that,
Right. Yeah.
Getting to the root of what's motivating my need to look for other jobs or to buy this or that thing or to live in a nicer neighborhood, really examining what's driving all those choices is the first thing that I did and that I think people need to do.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Finding that reason why you're making all of those purchases will definitely help you identify if it's something that you need to continue doing or something that you might be able to cut out or cut back on. I definitely like the idea to unsubscribe from a lot of shopping lists and stuff. We get bombarded daily, on a minute-to-minute basis with ads to go buy every other thing out there. Doing as much as you can to, distance yourself from that is only going to help keep more money in your pocket, I think.
Yeah, and let's face it, most people's social media accounts exist to show the world how fabulous their lives are,
Right.
right? So to just recognize that social media is actually a type of advertising that a person is doing from themselves to the outside world. So
Right.
it's not really any different from seeing someone in a commercial driving a Lexus, it's like that's an advertisement for a car. It doesn't have to have any personal meaning to me.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great way to think about social media and looking at what other people post. At the root of a lot of people's problems can be, taking on debt in the first place. I know there's a lot of talk about, the student loan crisis and how we might be able to, fix that problem. I just wanted to ask, in your opinion, what do you think might be some more effective ways to try and prevent students from racking up so much debt in the first place? Do you think it's, maybe more education for the students, or maybe, more, tighter belts on the colleges, people lending the money? What do you think might be able to help solve this problem?
For sure, for sure. The first problem is that we need to acknowledge as a society that the old advice of like just work really hard and find what you love to do is not really accurate anymore. Not in a place where people are taking out so much money to get their education, right? And ironically, sometimes getting the education, it almost prevents you from doing the thing that you wanted to do in the first place rather than enables, right? Like
Right.
I could have worked on a million film sets for free before I had this student debt, right? But I thought I wasn't qualified and I needed some higher education. So, but then after I got the higher education, I couldn't work for $80 a day as a production assistant anymore because now I had financial obligation. Just at a very, very baseline thing, we need to stop telling people that, hey, if you just work hard, everything's going to be fine, because that's the exact idea that makes people say, well, this looks like a lot of money, but I'm just going to sign on the dotted line because I know I'm going to work hard and then everything pays off, right?
Right.
And it's so hard because I have talked to so many people who are like about to go to college or about to go to grad school, and they're about to sign a loan for $50,000 and they know they're going to sign another one the next year, another one the next year. And trying to tell them, hey, are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure this is the right choice? Basically falls on deaf ears, right? Because no one
Right.
was going to tell me not to go to NYU film school after I
Right.
got it, right? Like
Yeah.
no one could have convinced me not to go. It's more about just helping people say, okay, is school the best route for the life you ultimately want to have, right? It feels like school is the thing, like check the box, get the degree, get the job. In today's society, that's not always true. We have so many entrepreneurs. We have so many people using the internet and online media stuff to promote their brand or their products. It might be actually cheaper to just get an internship or be someone's right hand for a while than getting into so much debt, getting a formal education in that same topic. So I think not just telling people, oh, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't take out that much debt, probably will not be very helpful. But I think getting to like, hey, what do you want your life to look like? Do you want to work from 9 to 5? Do you want to get off work and go eat at a nice restaurant? Do you want the flexibility to pay for your friend's baby shower when she has one? Do you want to be that person, right? How do you want your life to look and feel versus just telling people not to go to school? Because that's not the answer either. We all stop
Right.
going to school.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's definitely going to be situations where school might not be the right choice for someone, but there's also going to be a lot of situations where those people still go to school. So I definitely think, stuff like your book and what Student Loan Planner are doing, helping people manage the debt that they have, because I think that's part of the problem too, that that we're starting to address is like, okay, you've already taken on the debt, so what can we do about it? How can we, still live a great life and not let it, not let it crush you.
And not getting surprised later. It's like, oh, like I wanted my
Right.
life to consist of A, B, and C, but now that I have this debt, it has to consist of X, Y, Z, thinking about that. And also, there's a difference between loving studying something and wanting that thing for a career too. In my current situation, I don't work in film, but I'm financially more successful than a lot of my counterparts and classmates. And that allows me to, when I do write, when I do creative things, it's completely whatever I want it to be, right? I'm not trying to meet someone else's, advertising deadlines or create
Right.
some content for something I don't really care about. And I realized that that's how I would prefer my life to be. I would like to have the financial stability, and I would like to do my creative work on my own time, exactly how I want to do it. So realizing that I don't have to stop, being creative, but I can also be financially successful was an important realization to me.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, if a lot more people realize that too, they won't feel so overwhelmed by their debt or tied to it. They can find different ways to still do something they're passionate about and also still be financially responsible and work their way out of debt. One thing that I think in terms of, living your best life or moving through your life and not letting debt stop you, a lot of people who have a lot of debt feel like they won't be able to qualify for a mortgage or be able to buy a house. And that's something that I saw that you've written about on the blog. So, for people who have a lot of debt, what would you tell them in terms of like whether or not they can get a house, and how can they manage to buy a house if they have student loan debt?
Yeah, so this is a whole chapter in my book. So first of all, the government and some states offer incentives to buy property or develop property in that area, maybe a rural area. Bringing yourself up to speed with exactly all the options would be the first step. And I approached mortgages just like I approached student debt refinancing, right? It's like before you start looking at houses, you can definitely go to a mortgage broker and they ask for your entire financial situation. You give it to them, and then they tell you this is what house you can afford, right?
Right.
And so maybe you live in an expensive city and that number is just way more money than you would ever have for a down payment. That's okay. All you need to know is you need to improve your debt to income ratio, and you need to improve probably your credit, right? Because if you have perfect credit, you can still get mortgages with over $100,000 of debt. I had two mortgages at one point while I still had over $100,000 of debt because my credit was perfect and I had a job with a good base salary that I could put on those applications. And that
Right.
was enough for them, really. So it goes back to, at the very least, start fixing your credit. If you can't fix your financial situation, start with your credit. And once your credit is great, the mortgages and all of those opportunities will eventually come, provided that you're doing your research and being realistic about, what's available in your area and stuff like that. So it's a process of not taking it personally when, someone tells you, hey, you don't have the money for this right now. No mortgage people will give you any money because of your situation. Okay, no problem. I'll improve it and I'll come back. Right? That's all you need to think.
Just have a couple more questions here for you personally. I mean, looking back on, everything that's happened up until this point, things that you've learned along the way, what would you say is the most impactful financial lesson that you've ever learned?
You're always better off being around people who have money. that's personally my takeaway, right? So the first step of me becoming more successful financially was believing that I was not inferior to people that had money, grew up with money, spent their whole life at private schools, etc. So, for example, right, I worked at this hedge fund. I was one of maybe three women who were working there. And it was trade floor, a lot of loud guys. I
Right.
did this in New York and in Singapore. Sometimes some of the guys would go get drinks after work or go get food and they would invite me. And I always said no for years. For 2 or 3 years, I would always say no because I just thought I won't have anything to contribute to the conversation. I'm not as smart as them. I'm not worthy to sit at their table. That guy's
Right.
apartment is $40,000 a month, whatever.
Yeah.
Right. And I kind of took myself out of the running. And finally, about 3 years in, one of the times I said, sure, I will come out for drinks. And it was great, right? We weren't talking about markets. We were talking about like what we watched on HBO, right? It was
Right. Yeah.
totally fine to be there. And I realized that for the last 2 years, I could have been making friends that could have helped me or could have at least been a role model I look up to and ask for financial help when I need it. Right. And now I have a ton of those friends, but it started with just being like, no, I'm not going to remove myself from the table. I deserve a seat at that table just like anyone else. Even though I'm not a trader or I don't make over $1 million a year, like I think that I have enough intrinsic value as a person that I can be friends with people that are a lot more successful than me. And so this is what I see the most, right? People that are struggling financially tend to be friends with other people in a similar situation.
Right.
And it's always better to be around people with money for a number of reasons. From just like they'll probably pick up the tab when you go out to dinner, basic
Right.
one, to like actually, that's one of my friends. When I first wanted to get a brokerage account, I didn't know anything about trading. He gave me his financial planner. She did a lot of calls with me where she very patiently answered my questions. And now I know more, Whereas if I'm hanging out with a bunch of Uber drivers and yoga teachers, like I probably am not going to get that type of knowledge from those conversations. So
Right.
it's just kind of like, how can I surround myself with smart people that are what I'm trying to be financially instead of feeling inferior to them?
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like that ties in with what we were talking about with, net worth and self-worth. So the last question that I had for you before we wrapped up is kind of similar to that, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a financial thing. Whether it's something that you learned or heard in your personal life or something that, you heard at work or in your professional career, what would you say is the best piece of advice that someone has ever given to you?
It was probably my professor at NYU, Catherine Lindbergh. I remember I had finished school and she was like, "What are you doing?" And I said, "It's really embarrassing. I'm going to work as a nanny to this wealthy family." And she said, "Never apologize for a paycheck, ever. It doesn't matter if the money was gained doing your dream job or just doing something to make ends meet. It doesn't define me. And I don't have to feel guilty or bad about something I did to keep myself afloat." I still think about that. It's like
Yeah.
if my paycheck may not come from me pursuing my ultimate dreams, but like I can still be proud of that money and that responsibility and what I've done.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with that. That's a great piece of advice. No matter, what someone's doing or what stage of life they're in, that's always going to be good advice for someone. So, Stephanie, that was all the questions that I had for you today. Thanks for taking time out of your day to come on the show and talk about your book.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim. And I really enjoyed our conversation and looking forward to to reading more of your blog and all that.
If you're listening to this on iTunes, please subscribe to the podcast to get new episodes every week. And feel free to leave us a review or a comment because it would really mean a lot to us. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at LWM_podcast for more news and updates about the show. For the listeners out there, I will link in the show notes to Stephanie's blog, youarenotyourdebt.com, and also where you can find the book By the Avocado Toast, A Guide to Crushing Student Debt, Making More Money, and Living Your Best Life. Again, that's out March 31st of this year, so be sure to check that out. Thanks for tuning into this episode, and we will catch you on the next one.